The Titanic conspiracy, the ship that shouldn't have sunk. A ship, hailed as unsinkable, set sail on its maiden voyage. Days later, it lies at the bottom of the ocean. But was it truly an accident, or part of a much larger conspiracy that has haunted history for more than a century? The sinking of the RMS Titanic on April 15, 1912, is often remembered as one of the greatest maritime disasters in history. Over 1,500 people lost their lives in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic after the unsinkable ship struck an iceberg. That's the story we've been told. But behind the headlines of icebergs and lifeboats, whispers of conspiracy emerged, whispers that refused to die. Could it be that the Titanic was never supposed to survive that night? Was the tragedy really an accident? Or was it planned? When the Titanic was built, it was more than a ship. It was a symbol of wealth, pride, and progress. Owned by the White Star Line, she was the crown jewel of luxury travel, boasting state-of-the-art technology, lavish interiors, and an aura of invincibility. But here's where the story starts to get murky. According to some theories, the Titanic that sailed may not have been the Titanic at all, but her nearly identical sister ship, the RMS Olympic, months before the Titanic's first voyage, the Olympic had suffered a serious collision that left it badly damaged. Insurance couldn't cover the costs. So, was a switch made? Some believe the damaged Olympic was disguised as the Titanic, sent out on a doomed voyage for the insurance payout. If true, the tragedy wasn't fate, it was fraud on an unimaginable scale. And then, there's the question of who was on board. Among the passengers were some of the wealthiest and most influential men of the era: John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. But these men were not just wealthy, they were also powerful opponents of the creation of the US Federal Reserve, a central banking system that would reshape global finance. When the Titanic sank, all three men perished. But the man behind the Federal Reserve's creation, J.P. Morgan, the financier who also owned the White Star Line, was supposed to be on the voyage. At the last moment, he cancelled his trip, citing illness. Days later, the ship was gone, and with it, some of the greatest obstacles to Morgan's plans. Coincidence? Or something far darker? There's more. Survivors reported hearing strange explosions deep inside the ship before it began to sink. Some described the Titanic splitting apart not from an iceberg alone, but from within, as though something had been planned. Others claimed the route itself had been suspicious, directing the ship into iceberg-heavy waters with an unusual speed and recklessness. And then there's the lifeboats. Why were there not enough? Why was a ship, supposedly prepared for luxury and safety, allowed to sail with barely half the lifeboats needed for passengers and crew? Was it arrogance, or part of a deliberate setup to ensure mass casualties? For decades, researchers, authors, and investigators have pored over the Titanic story, uncovering inconsistencies that continue to puzzle us. Official records insist it was an iceberg. End of story. But if it truly was that simple, why do the questions keep coming back? Why did J.P. Morgan cancel? Why were some of his fiercest rivals on board? Why do shipbuilders, engineers, and survivors report details that don't add up? And perhaps the most haunting question, was the Titanic always doomed before she ever left port? Imagine it, a ship built to inspire or praised as unsinkable, carrying the dreams of thousands across the Atlantic. But what if every detail, the switch, the course, the passengers chosen to be on board, was part of a puzzle we are only beginning to piece together? The Titanic isn't just a story of ice and water. It's a story of money, power, and hidden agendas. A story that forces us to ask whether history's greatest disaster was truly an accident, or a carefully orchestrated event meant to change the world. Over 100 years later, we still don't have definitive answers. But one fact remains chilling: those who stood to gain most from the tragedy, men like J.P. Morgan, did. The Federal Reserve was established the very next year, in 1913. A system that shaped the financial world we live in today. The Titanic, then, was not just a shipwreck. It may have been the turning point of global economics, a sacrifice of lives for the rise of power. And that's why, even today, the Titanic is more than a sunken ship. It's a symbol of mystery, of cover-ups, and of the haunting possibility that the ocean holds secrets we may never fully uncover. The Titanic sailed as a beacon of human achievement. It sank as one of humanity's greatest tragedies. But when we peel back the layers of the official story, we find cracks that suggest the truth may be stranger, darker, and more calculated than we've ever been told. The world remembers April 15, 1912, as the night the Titanic was lost. But maybe, just maybe, it was also the night the world was changed. Forever.